beneath the shimmering crowns and golden halls, medieval royal families hid a deadly curse, their own blood. Generations of intermarriage, meant to preserve purity and power, instead created silent killers. Princes were born frail, queens wasted away before their time, and kings raged in madness no priest could calm. The Habsburgs of Europe, proud and mighty, carried a deformity that twisted their faces, the infamous Habsburg jaw. Meanwhile, Spain's royal line ended with Charles II, a man so inbred that he could barely chew, speak, or produce an heir. His death marked not just the fall of a dynasty, but the punishment of nature itself. Behind closed doors, alchemists whispered of curses and divine wrath. In truth, it was no spell. It was science centuries ahead of its time. The royal obsession with keeping bloodlines pure became their slow destruction. And as empires crumbled, one truth remained. The greatest threat to kings was never rebellion. It was their own lineage. Royal marriages were never about love. They were weapons of politics. Princes wed cousins. Queens married nephews. And dynasties folded in on themselves like dying stars. Within the palaces of Europe, inbreeding bred weakness, deformity, and despair. In the courts of Spain and Austria, infants were born blue and fragile. Doctors bled them, prayed over them, but no cure came. Hemophilia, epilepsy, and mental decline haunted royal nurseries. The same diseases that began in whispers would one day echo across kingdoms. By the time of the late Habsburgs, the damage was visible. Charles II of Spain, the bewitched king, could not rule, could not father children, and could barely speak coherently. His family tree had become a tragic circle. The royal physicians called it a mystery. The priests called it a curse. But the truth was simple. The kings had poisoned their own thrones. In trying to preserve their power, they had destroyed it, leaving a legacy of fragile heirs and dying dynasties. The purest blood in Europe had become its deadliest secret. To the common people, royal blood was sacred, touched by God. But inside castle walls, that divine blood often carried monsters within. Genetic disorders passed from mother to son, uncle to niece, weaving invisible threads of suffering through Europe's royal families. In England, madness ran through the veins of the Plantagenets and Tudors. Kings spoke to ghosts, raged at servants, and vanished into isolation. In Russia, the Romanovs would later be cursed by hemophilia, the royal disease that turned a simple wound into a death sentence. The more families intermarried, the stronger the curse grew. No physician could understand it. No prayer could stop it. Behind tapestries and golden doors, rulers trembled, knowing that their own heirs might be born doomed. The belief in divine right had become a cruel irony. Their crowns glittered, but their bodies rotted from within. The royal blood that was meant to unite kingdoms instead divided them, a warning carved into history that power, when hoarded, always turns poisonous in medieval courts. Royal incest was not scandal. It was strategy. Marriages between siblings, cousins, even uncles and nieces were celebrated as triumphs of dynastic unity. But behind every wedding feast lurked a darker truth. Each union tightened the noose of genetic decay. The Spanish Habsburgs perfected this deadly tradition. Their royal archives reveal shocking patterns: uncles marrying nieces, cousins uniting over and over until the bloodline grew frail and cursed. Charles II, the last Habsburg king, was its living proof: stunted, infertile, and haunted by seizures. Whispers spread through the courts. God has turned against the crown. Priests performed exorcisms. Healers blamed demons. Yet, the cause was in their very veins. Each generation inherited not just power, but sickness, deformity, and madness. What began as a way to preserve royal blood became its executioner. Behind every royal portrait, painted in elegance, lay centuries of pain, decay, and lost heirs. The crown that gleamed brightest often hid the deepest rot. The collapse of great medieval empires wasn't always caused by war or betrayal. Sometimes it began in the womb. Inbreeding, the silent destroyer of dynasties, spread through royal Europe like a plague wrapped in silk. The logic was simple and deadly. Keep the blood royal. Cousins married cousins, and thrones passed to sickly heirs too weak to rule. Behind closed doors, midwives carried stillborn princes. Heirs died before their first steps. Spain's decline under Charles II was only one of many. The Portuguese crown, too, fell into chaos as generations of intermarriage produced rulers unfit for power. In England, whispers about madness in the royal family hinted at the same silent curse. Doctors of the time saw only symptoms: frailty, seizures, infertility, never the pattern. They blamed the stars or the devil, not the blood itself. But history saw the truth. No sword or rebellion was as deadly as royal arrogance. The desire to keep bloodlines pure had destroyed them from within, turning once mighty kingdoms into fragile, dying legacies. From the cold halls of Spain to the marble courts of France, whispers of the royal curse haunted generations of kings and queens. Physicians swore it was witchcraft. Priests cried divine punishment. But the truth was simpler. It lived within their blood. Each heir was born carrying invisible defects, weak hearts, trembling hands, and minds slipping into madness. The Spanish Habsburgs, proud of their pure lineage, unknowingly sealed their doom. Charles II, their final king, was said to have one body and no strength. He drooled, seized, and spoke nonsense, his bloodline collapsing with him. In France, madness spread through noble families. England's King Henry VI talked to ghosts, and his grandson, Henry VIII, suffered chronic pain that twisted his temper into cruelty. Every dynasty bore its burden, hidden illnesses shaping politics, alliances, and wars. The royal curse was never a spell from witches or heretics. It was biology, misunderstood by medieval minds. The very pride that crowned kings also destroyed them. The kingdoms that once ruled the world learned too late that divine blood could be as deadly as any plague. Royal blood was said to be blue, pure, divine, and untouched by commoners. But that blue blood often hid secrets, black as night. In palaces filled with gold, the royal families of Europe guarded a truth they dared not speak. Their children were sick, their heirs broken. In Spain, Austria, and England, the same story repeated. Infants born pale and trembling, heirs dying before their coronation. Queens lost two mysterious fevers. King Charles II of Spain, born after generations of intermarriage, was the tragic result. His family tree was so entangled that he had fewer ancestors than a peasant. His jaw jutted forward, his tongue too large for speech, and his mind often lost in confusion. Doctors blamed curses. Priests performed exorcisms. Yet no holy water could wash away generations of genetic damage. The blue blood that symbolized royal superiority became their downfall. As empires weakened and thrones emptied, the myth of divine purity shattered. The royal families who ruled millions could not conquer the disease within their own veins. A reminder that no crown can protect against the truth written in blood. The Middle Ages were an age of swords, crusades, and kings. Yet many of those kings were prisoners of their own bodies. Hereditary illnesses passed through centuries of royal intermarriage silently shaped the fate of kingdoms. King Henry VI of England descended into insanity, believing he spoke with saints. In France, Charles VI, the mad, attacked his servants in paranoid fits. Their mental decline wasn't coincidence but a genetic inheritance. In Spain, things were worse. Charles II was born so deformed and sickly that courtiers whispered he was bewitched. In truth, his genes were poisoned by centuries of incest. He couldn't eat without help, couldn't walk properly, and died childless, ending the Habsburg dynasty. These illnesses weren't just personal tragedies. They altered history. Wars broke out, overthrows left heirless, treaties collapsed, and nations fell into chaos. Medieval medicine had no cure, no explanation. They blamed demons, sorcery, and sin. But the real enemy was royal pride, the obsession with pure blood that left Europe's greatest rulers broken, diseased, and forgotten. Their crowns gleamed in gold, but their bones carried the curse of their ancestors. To keep crowns secure, royals married within brother to sister, cousin to cousin, uncle to niece. It was the rule of power and the curse of blood. The medieval royal gene pool became a trap, shrinking until entire dynasties carried the same hidden defects. The Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs were its most tragic victims. Their insistence on pure blood produced weak heirs, twisted jaws, and minds that failed before their time. Charles II of Spain, known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, embodied centuries of inbreeding.
Born with a deformed skull and swollen tongue, he could barely eat or speak.
He was the last of his line, a dynasty undone, not by rebellion, but by biology. Akarasu! Ropa royal physicians recorded strange diseases, bleeding disorders, madness, infertility. The kings ruled empires, yet couldn't save their own lineage. Each generation became a living experiment, a warning of what happens when power outweighs reason. Behind the crowns, portraits, and legends lay a truth more terrifying than any war. The royal families had built empires on the bones of their own blood. Behind every royal crown lay a fragile mind. Madness ran through Europe's thrones like wildfire, unexplainable, feared, and hushed by But this madness was not divine punishment. It was inheritance. King Charles VI of France believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. England's Henry VI heard voices and fell into catatonic trances. Even later, monarchs like Spain's Philip V suffered crippling depression and hysteria. All shared a common thread: intermarriage. Royal families, desperate to preserve alliances, traded brides among their own bloodlines. Generation after generation, recessive genes compounded into tragedy. Behind locked doors, priests performed exorcisms and physicians bled the afflicted, thinking madness could be drained like bad humors. Yet, the true poison was genetic, not spiritual. These hidden disorders shaped the course of Europe. Kings too unstable to rule plunged nations into war or left them vulnerable to collapse. The image of royal perfection was an illusion. Beneath velvet robes and jeweled crowns were fragile minds, breaking under centuries of inherited flaws. Their madness became legend, but its source was as real as the blood in their veins. For centuries, royal families believed their blood was sacred, chosen by God, and purer than all others. But that belief became their undoing. To preserve royal purity, kings and queens married within their own families, creating generations trapped in a cycle of sickness. By the late Middle Ages, this inbreeding curse had spread across Europe. The Habsburgs of Spain and Austria, once the most powerful dynasty in the world, became symbols of genetic decay. Cousins married cousins for centuries until deformities appeared that no physician could cure. King Charles II of Spain, their final heir, was the embodiment of this tragedy. His tongue was too large to speak clearly, his body frail and twisted. He was plagued by seizures and infertility, the last of his bloodline, unable to produce an heir. His death in 1700 ended an empire, but his story began long before him with ancestors who confused bloodline with divinity. The inbreeding curse wasn't just physical, it was moral. It revealed the arrogance of monarchs who valued power over nature's laws. The kings who ruled millions were powerless against their own corrupted blood. Every royal birth was celebrated with bells, feasts, and prayers. But beneath the joy lay dread. Would the child be healthy, or carry the family's curse? For medieval royals, being born to rule often meant being born to suffer. Hemophilia, epilepsy, madness, and deformities haunted royal palaces. Because families refused to marry outside their circle, these diseases spread silently, generation after generation. Young princes were raised as symbols of strength, but many could barely walk or see. Some died before their coronation. Others ruled while crippled by pain. Charles II of Spain, the most infamous example, was described by his doctors as a miracle that he lives. Across Europe, other rulers shared his fate, their health destroyed by ancestry. Behind the throne's grandeur, the reality was grim. Royal physicians could offer only leeches, herbs, or prayers. No one dared speak the truth, that royal pride had poisoned their blood. To be born royal was to inherit both privilege and suffering. Their crowns glittered, their bodies decayed, and history remembered them not for glory, but for the silent agony that ruled their lives. Hemophilia, the royal disease, turned small cuts into death sentences. Though it became infamous in later centuries, its seeds were sown long before, in the medieval era's tangled family trees. Royal children bled uncontrollably from minor wounds. Bruises appeared like curses. Priests whispered of demons, while physicians blamed the stars. But it was heredity passed through generations of intermarriage. In medieval courts, such illnesses were hidden. The weakness of a prince meant instability, and instability meant war. Mothers wept in silence, watching sons bleed from a nose or fall and never rise again. The same bloodlines that claimed divine right carried insanity as well. England's Henry VI, France's Charles VI, both descended from interwoven families. Both lost their minds. One saw visions of angels. The other thought his body was made of glass. The irony was cruel. The royal families who ruled through blood were destroyed by it. Their divine lineage became their damnation, proving that even kings could not command the secrets written in their veins. Every crown carried a curse, not from sorcery, but from blood. Royal families, bound by pride and politics, refused to marry outside their circle. Each union tightened the web of disease that would strangle their dynasties. In Spain, Austria, and France, deformities appeared in portraits once meant to symbolize perfection. Habsburg jaws, drooping lips, and vacant stares became haunting trademarks of a doomed lineage. Charles II of Spain, the final Habsburg monarch, was both king and victim. His body was weak, his mind unstable, his face disfigured. Courtiers whispered he was bewitched, yet the curse was of their own making. Centuries of inbreeding disguised as royal tradition. The priests blamed witches, the doctors blamed the stars, but the true culprit was vanity. To keep power pure, monarchs ignored nature's laws until their thrones were built on broken genes. By the 17th century, Europe's mightiest families were collapsing. No heirs, no health, no future.
The crowns that once gleamed in glory had become symbols of decay, reminders that no dynasty, however divine, could escape the price of its own arrogance.
Inside the golden halls of medieval palaces, madness was a quiet guest. It crept through royal bloodlines, inherited like jewels, yet feared like sin. King Charles VI of France suffered violent fits and hallucinations, believing his body was made of glass. England's Henry VI fell into endless trances, unable to recognize his own wife. Their madness wasn't divine punishment, it was hereditary. Generations of intermarriage among royal families had concentrated genetic defects. Cousins married cousins, and uncles married nieces, until the same tainted blood flowed through every crown in Europe. Courtiers hid the truth. They called it melancholy or holy visions. Physicians prescribed herbs and prayers, while priests conducted exorcisms. But behind the rituals, everyone knew the kings were losing their minds. Their instability changed history. Wars erupted, treaties shattered, an entire nation suffered because a ruler's mind was broken. In their quest for eternal power, royals had trapped themselves in a cage of blood. Madness became their inheritance, and their crowns, once symbols of strength, became the heaviest burdens of all. Royal love was never about affection. It was about blood. In medieval Europe, the noblest families guarded their lineage like treasure, marrying siblings and cousins to preserve royal purity. Yet that very love for bloodline became a curse that destroyed them. In the courts of Spain and Austria, family trees folded in upon themselves. Marriages between close relatives produced fragile heirs, some deaf, some deformed, others unable to speak. The most tragic of all was Charles II of Spain, the bewitched king. His parents were uncle and niece. His body was frail, his mind fogged by seizures. He was unable to produce an heir, his dynasty dying with him. The church called it God's punishment, but it was human arrogance. Royals believed their blood divine, yet every generation carried more weakness than the last. Behind silken curtains and gilded portraits, entire families rotted from the inside. The passion that was supposed to protect their crowns ensured their extinction. In trying to preserve love and power within, they had married death itself, proving that even the most powerful hearts can destroy themselves in the name of pride. The royal families of medieval Europe believed their blood made them superior, chosen by heaven to rule. But that same blood became their greatest curse. Through centuries of intermarriage, hidden disorders emerged: hemophilia, infertility, deformities, and madness. From Spain's Habsburgs to England's Plantagenets, the pattern repeated like a tragic song.
King Charles II of Spain stood as its ultimate verse.
His Habsburg jaw jutted grotesquely, his mind clouded by seizures, his body too weak for rule. The doctors who examined him found the bloodline so entangled that his family tree resembled a circle. But Spain wasn't alone. In France, Charles VI descended into delusions. In England, Henry VI heard the voice of God while his kingdom burned in war. These disorders shaped history more than any sword.
Wars of succession, religious uprisings, and failed heirs all stemmed from the invisible sickness of royal blood. The bloody legacy of Europe as monarchs wasn't written by conquerors. It was written in their genes.
Power had poisoned their blood, and by the time they realized it, their dynasties were already dying. The palaces of medieval Europe gleamed with jewels, but within their walls, pain reigned quietly. Royalty came at a terrible price, one paid through the suffering of their own bodies. From birth, princes and princesses were bound to bloodlines that carried hidden afflictions. Hemophilia made their wounds lethal. Madness clouded their minds, and deformities marked their faces. The Habsburgs of Spain and Austria embodied this tragedy. Charles II was so sickly that courtiers feared he wouldn't survive childhood. He did, but barely. His speech was slurred, his spine twisted, and his mind constantly in torment. No physician dared tell the truth. To question the king's health was to question divine order. So they called his suffering the will of God. In reality, it was the cost of ambition. By refusing to mix their blood with commoners, the royals sealed their fate. Their castles became prisons of sickness, their crowns symbols of decay. The kings and queens who ruled empires ruled also over their own agony, a kingdom built on blood, ruled by pain, and destined to end in silence. Behind every royal portrait lies a secret, one carefully erased from history books. The noble families of medieval Europe weren't just victims of war and treason. They were victims of their own blood. Generations of intermarriage had created genetic time bombs. Heirs were born with weak hearts, twisted bones, or fragile minds. Some couldn't walk. Others couldn't think clearly enough to rule. In Spain, Charles II's reign became a living nightmare. His jaw hung low, his tongue oversized, his body frail. Behind closed doors, doctors performed exorcisms, convinced he was cursed. Yet the curse was centuries of inbreeding catching up to royalty. The Vatican suppressed medical records. Painters softened deformities in portraits, and chroniclers omitted the truth. To admit weakness in the royal bloodline was unthinkable, but the truth always seeps through. The blue blood of kings wasn't divine, it was dying. The same purity they worshipped became their greatest shame. The dark side of royal blood wasn't just disease, it was denial. The kings who ruled in the name of God refused to see that their greatest enemy lived within them. The thrones of medieval Europe stood tall, but their rulers were often too weak to sit upon them. Disease ran through royal veins like poison, shaping history more than any war ever could. King Henry VI's madness fractured England, leading to the Wars of the Roses. Charles VI of France's delusions left his kingdom in chaos. And in Spain, the final Habsburg king Charles II, could neither lead nor produce an heir, ending centuries of imperial dominance. Each illness rippled beyond the palace walls. Amiens Marechetto treaties crumbled, and nations fell because kings were sick, broken, or mad. Medieval medicine offered no answers, only leeches, chants, and prayers. Physicians called it fate, but it was genetics, centuries of inbreeding, eroding the foundation of power. The divine right to rule became a cruel irony. The royals who claimed God's blessing were undone by their own design. History remembers their crowns and wars, but their truest legacy lies in the bloodlines that doomed them, proof that even the mightiest thrones can collapse under the weight of their own sickness. In the gilded halls of medieval Europe, incest was not a sin, it was strategy. To keep kingdoms united and power consolidated, royals married their own kin. Cousins, uncles and niece, all bound by vows, written in the same blood.
But every alliance came with a deadly price.
Over generations, the royal gene pool shrank into a pool of sickness. Children were born pale and frail, their bones soft, their minds clouded. The Spanish Habsburgs became the most tragic example. Charles II, product of relentless inbreeding, was so weak he could barely chew his food. His blood carried centuries of incest, each generation tightening nature's noose. He could not father an heir, and when he died, so did his dynasty. Across Europe! Similar tales unfolded. Behind every royal wedding was a silent epidemic spreading through bloodlines. Priests called it divine punishment. Physicians whispered of tainted humors. But the truth was genetic, not holy. In the end, the royals who feared mixing with common blood ensured their extinction. The purest families in Europe became their own executioners, killed not by rebellion, but by their desire to remain untouchable. The royal family tree of medieval Europe was less a tree and more a noose, twisted, tangled, and strangling its heirs. Generations of marriages between cousins and uncles created bloodlines, so interwoven that entire dynasties shared the same ancestors. The Habsburgs were the most notorious. Their obsession with pure blood produced the infamous Habsburg jaw, a protruding chin and swollen tongue that distorted speech. King Charles II's genealogy chart reads like a warning. One great-grandparent repeated multiple times. Uncles marrying nieces, cousins uniting again and again. His health reflected it all. He suffered seizures, infertility, and deformities that shocked his court. By the time he took the throne, he was barely human in strength, more ghost than king. Yet, this wasn't unique to Spain. Across Europe in Austria, France, and Portugal, royal inbreeding created fragile heirs, infant deaths, and fading dynasties. The twisted family tree stood as a grim monument to human arrogance. In their pursuit of divine lineage, kings defied nature itself, and nature, patient and merciless, collected her debt, one heir at a time, until the branches broke under their own corruption. The true plague of medieval royalty was not carried by rats or fleas, it lived in their blood. While peasants feared the Black Death, nobles faced a quieter enemy, hereditary disease born of inbreeding and secrecy. Kings and queens were raised to believe their blood was sacred, but that sacredness came with sickness, hemophilia, infertility, and madness, spreading through generations. Charles II of Spain, pale and trembling, was its final product. His marriage to his own niece sealed his dynasty's fate. Courtiers described him as more dead than alive. His eyes were sunken, his body frail, his speech slurred. Behind locked palace doors, royal physicians performed desperate rituals, burning herbs, bleeding the king, even summoning priests to expel demons. But no prayer could cleanse his blood. Across Europe, monarchs shared his fate. Some hid their deformities behind painted portraits. Others vanished from records entirely. The crown was supposed to symbolize divine perfection. Instead, it became a mask hiding centuries of decay. The true plague of the crown was not pestilence from outside. It was a disease born from pride within. Every dynasty dreams of lasting forever. But the medieval monarchs of Europe built their empires on the weakest foundation of all, their own blood. To secure alliances, they married close kin, again and again, trapping themselves in a genetic labyrinth. With each generation, their children became weaker, their heirs fewer. The Habsburgs of Spain are history's clearest example. Their pride in pure blood created generations of deformities. By the time Charles II ascended the throne, his dynasty was a shadow of its past. He was sterile, epileptic, and mentally unfit to rule the final echo of a doomed empire. Elsewhere, the same story unfolded. Madness gripped England, weakness plagued France, and infertility haunted Portugal. The crowns glittered, but the bodies beneath them broke. Historians later traced the pattern. The same ancestors repeated for centuries, the same diseases passed like curses. The so-called divine bloodlines of Europe were not blessed. They were burdened. Their power rotted from within until nothing remained but names carved on empty thrones and the memory of kings destroyed by their own blood. Behind the splendor of medieval courts lay a grotesque secret. Europe's kings and queens were marrying themselves into extinction. To preserve divine right, they wove family ties so tightly that their descendants were born sick, deformed, or insane. The Habsburgs became a living example. Centuries of inbreeding gave them protruding jaws, sunken eyes, and bodies frail as glass. Charles II of Spain, the dynasty's last heir, could barely walk, talk, or think. He was described as the king who should never have lived. But the curse stretched beyond Spain. Across the continent, royal families shared ancestors, passing on madness and disease. France's Charles VI attacked his own men in delusion. England's Henry VI spoke to ghosts. Every throne carried the same hidden infection, generations of blood too pure to survive. The people saw divine rulers. History sees victims of their own arrogance. The crowns that once symbolized strength became marks of decay. The inbred kings and cursed queens of medieval Europe proved one eternal truth. Even the most powerful cannot defy the laws of life and blood. The crowns of medieval Europe glittered with jewels, but beneath the gold flowed cursed blood. Royal families, obsessed with keeping power pure, married within their own circles for centuries. Cousins wedded cousins, and uncles took nieces as brides, believing divine lineage could never decay. But it did. Each generation grew weaker. Children were born sickly, trembling, and short-lived. The Habsburg dynasty became the perfect tragedy. Their kings and queens looked noble in portraits, but behind the paint lay deformities and disease. Charles II of Spain was the final warning. His blood was so inbred that his ancestors appeared multiple times in his own family tree. He could barely eat or speak, and his mind was clouded by confusion. The court whispered of witchcraft, but the real curse was his lineage. When Charles died childless, so did his dynasty. The great Habsburg Empire, once mighty, collapsed under its own blood. Across Europa, other families followed, their thrones empty, their heirs dead before 20.
The royal blood curse wasn't magic.
It was science misunderstood, a cruel reminder that nature cannot be controlled, no matter how blue your blood runs. In the candlelit nurseries of medieval palaces, the cries of royal infants often faded too soon. Heirs were born pale, weak, and trembling, victims of centuries of inbreeding. The court physicians called it divine trial, but it was hereditary decay. The Habsburgs, Bourbons, and Tudors all suffered the same silent tragedy. Each family, desperate to protect its throne, chose bloodlines over health. The result was a generation of dying princes. Charles II of Spain could barely stand without help. His bones were soft, his tongue too large for his mouth. Across the sea, England's Edward VI wasted away before his 18th year, his fragile body never fit for a crown. Behind every grand coronation lay endless funerals, small coffins lined with silk. The people saw it as God's will. The truth was closer to nature's rebellion. The royal families who ruled millions could not conquer their own blood. Each newborn heir carried the ghosts of generations past, their weakness, the price of royal pride. The pale heirs of medieval Europe stood as tragic symbols, proof that no amount of gold could buy the strength stolen by inbreeding. Charles II of Spain was never meant to live, yet he was born to be king. His birth was hailed as a miracle, but within months, whispers spread through the court. The infant could not hold his head upright, could not swallow properly, could not walk. The Habsburg bloodline had turned toxic after generations of inbreeding. Charles's family tree was a circle. His parents, uncle, and grandparents were all connected by shared ancestors. The result was devastating. As a child, he suffered seizures. As a man, he was sterile and nearly mute. His face, distorted by the famous Habsburg jaw, made eating painful.
The king's physicians blamed demons.
Priests ordered exorcisms, yet the truth lay in his blood. The Spanish Empire, once the world's most powerful, crumbled as its monarch faded. Charles was a living corpse on the throne, surrounded by courtiers pretending he ruled. When he died in 1700, childless and broken, the Habsburg dynasty in Spain died with him. His death was not murder or rebellion. It was nature as quiet justice for centuries of arrogance. The last Habsburg king became the symbol of a dynasty that destroyed itself from within. The crown, in medieval times, was not just a symbol of power. It was a curse passed through blood. The kings of Europe ruled vast empires, but could not rule their own minds. Madness haunted their palaces, whispered through their bloodlines, and devoured their heirs. England's King Henry VI spoke to unseen voices, collapsing entrance like states for months. France's Charles VI attacked his own knights, convinced he was made of glass. Spain's Charles II, inbred beyond saving, was barely human in form or thought. These were not isolated tragedies, they were inherited fates. Each family, bound by generations of intermarriage, carried the same sickness of body and mind.
Physicians of the age bled and purged them. Priests prayed.
And alchemists brewed potions, yet nothing could cure the blood that bred itself into madness. The people feared witches or divine punishment, never realizing the truth. It was the royals' own vanity that cursed them. The cost of absolute power was not paid in gold or war. It was paid in sanity. The royal blood that once symbolized greatness became a slow poison, driving kings insane beneath their crowns. By the late Middle Ages, Europe's royal families ruled kingdoms, but their bodies were crumbling. Generations of intermarriage, secrecy, and superstition had turned divine bloodlines into fragile chains. The Habsburgs of Spain, the Valois of France, the Tudors of England all bore the marks of hereditary decay. Crooked spines, swollen jaws, infertility, and madness were as common as crowns. Charles II of Spain became the final chapter of this decay. His birth was hailed as divine, yet his life was a living death. Unable to rule, speak clearly, or produce an heir, he watched his empire die with him.
Across Europe. The same pattern repeated. Thrones passing to distant relatives.
Dynasties vanishing without heirs, and royal portraits hiding deformities behind painted perfection. It was not war or rebellion that destroyed these empires. It was biology. Nature reclaimed what power had corrupted. When the last inbred kings were buried, the age of divine monarchy ended. The thrones of decay became monuments to human arrogance. A reminder that no crown can protect against the quiet vengeance of blood.